could speak for much longer than 5-7 minutes because the current world situation would require much more time for someone to rationally, intelligently elaborate on it. But let me start by with what is positive. Positive is in our region. When I was at Harvard in 98, Suharto was still in office. We still had the Suharto regime in Indonesia. By that same year, 98, Suharto was no longer. And he resigned, and then began a very painful, difficult transition from Suharto era to democracy. Indonesia today, 280 million people, one of the most dynamic democracies, maybe imperfect, like the American democracy is also imperfect, like ours is imperfect, but it is a dynamic democracy. Worldwide respectability it acquires. And there are other positive news in our region. Of course, not so good news in regard to Myanmar. What a tragic situation. And the world community reacting strong enough in regard to Ukraine, not strong enough in regard to Gaza, and almost zero in regard to Myanmar. Moving on to another bright positive spot. There are many in Asia, in Southeast Asia, but my own country, Timor-Leste. Let me just say, we are rated number 20 in media freedom out of 100 plus countries. 2 years ago, we were rated number 10. I don't know why we bumped up to 20. But we're still better than the US, we're still better than France, UK, Germany, Australia, and so on. In terms of democracy, we are rated the best in Asia. So these are some very important positive news. Equally important is that we are at peace. We have zero political violence, zero ethnic-based or religious-based tensions or violence. We do not have armed robbery. We do not have organized crime of any sort. No major drug problems. So we are an oasis of democracy, of tranquility in this troubled world today. But how can we contribute through this kind of forum to improving the situations in Gaza, Palestine, in Ukraine? Far too complex. I just hope that President Trump, because the US is still an indispensable global power. I use the word indispensable because there is no substitute for US leadership. But US leadership, to be global, to be respected, it has to lead with persuasion, in partnership of equals, even when we know we are not equals. The US is number one economy, 400 million people, nuclear power, and little Timor-Leste, well, I don't have a, but let's say, use the word academically speaking, partnership of equals, whereby you treat everyone with respect, like China, India, but also your European Atlantic partners. So the US under Trump can mobilize the world community to address the Palestinian tragedy, to resolve the Ukraine catastrophe that happened in this 21st century, 80 years after World War II, 20 years, 30 years after the Balkans crisis. The Europeans have now to confront this situation at their gates to Russia, and Russia has to deal with this situation. An invasion is an invasion. International law is very clear. No acquisition of territory by force, no use of force or threats in international relations. But it did happen. The reasons we can all argue about it. We all know why Putin did what he did. But now how to resolve it? Of course, dialogue, civilized dialogue, respectful dialogue, where there are no one humiliated, no one is completely the loser. A win-win situation means precisely this, that all sides have to make concessions for the sake of peace, because the cost of war will be more costly, is already more costly than the cost of peace. In regard to Gaza, again, President Trump, US leadership, is the one that can finally do justice to the Palestinians, because they are people like us, like you. Do not blame all the Palestinians, do not rob their rights because of Hamas. But understand also why Hamas emerged. If we don't understand why a particular movement emerged, in reaction to what, to do what, we will never do justice, we will never resolve the problem. The US side has shown in recent history that it was able to talk to those who in the past, until only a few weeks ago, were labeled terrorists. So the US have enough wisdom, flexibility to talk with everybody in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This would be the greatest contribution of all of us, by speaking out, by encouraging. Do not demonize the Palestinians as we should not demonize Israelis. Least of all, demonize and hate Jews. Yes, Israeli Jews have suffered also enough through centuries. It's not only World War II, not only the Holocaust. They were discriminated, excluded. But one region of the world, they were not excluded. They were welcomed when they were expelled from Europe. In the Arab world. Back then, the Arabs didn't know anything about hating Jews. So there is good in everyone. And I'm not saying this only rhetorically. It's our own example, Timor-Leste. We didn't demonize anyone throughout our struggle. Indonesians were Indonesians, they were people. They were Muslims. We are Catholic. We are 99.6% Catholic. We reached out after independence. Indonesia reciprocated. Indonesia showed statesmanship in accepting to reconcile with Timor-Leste. Today we have the best relationship. So there are good examples for the world to look at, not necessarily to copy-paste, but to look at. So my contribution today, coming from a small country, Timor-Leste, we will be joining ASEAN very soon. In the next 2, 3 months, 6 months, we'll be full members of ASEAN. Thanks to ASEAN leaders' wisdom in welcoming and supporting us to join this great organization. We have no lessons to share with anyone. We share only our experience, and our experience shows humility, persistence, no hatred, no hating anyone, no exclusion, no persecution of previous people who were previously on the other side. We can resolve the most intricate, complex problems. I'm sorry I have to stop here because I was given 7 minutes or 8 minutes. Tamara, Esther, thank you so much. Terima kasih for inviting me to this great forum at this great university. Greetings to all of you, academics and students at Harvard. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, President Jose Ramos-Horta. Thank you so much for joining us for President Jose Ramos-Horta's keynote address. As his message was delivered via video, we wanted to ensure that there is still an outlet for feedback and constructive dialogue. If you have any comments or questions regarding his remarks, we will pass them along to the Office of the President of Timor-Leste. Please feel free to submit your thoughts to any of the organizers. And with that, I'll hand it over to Colin to introduce our next panel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Asia-Pacific Conference. In case you missed my introduction at the beginning, I'm Colin. I am one of the co-presidents of the Korea Caucus here at HKS. It is a great privilege for me to open this panel and the very last panel and very important panel on the geopolitics for the Asia-Pacific Conference beyond US-China security alliances and economic statecraft in multipolar Indo-Pacific. Considering the changes that we see in diplomacy, we believe understanding geopolitical changes in Asia is a crucial matter that will going to impact a lot of countries in Asia, so we want to ensure this panel can be a place that you can think about different changes they will have in Asia moving forward in the new administration in the US. So I would like to introduce all the panelists that we have for this session. When the introduction begins, it'll be great if the panelists can come up to the stage and take a seat. So first of all, I would like to introduce our moderator for the session, Sarah Davis. Sarah is an Australian Fulbright scholar completing her MBA and MPA at Stanford and Harvard University. Sarah is also an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she's also one of our co-chairs for the Asia-Pacific Conference this year. Sarah, I'd like to invite you to the stage. Thank you. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Greg Brown to our panel. Dr. Brown is a senior fellow at Austria Strategic Policy Institute USA and is also a subject matter expert on political demography. Dr. Brown has a diverse and long experience in the US national security and also emerging security issues in Oceania and Southeast Asia. Dr. Greg Brown, I'd like to invite you to the stage. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Lynn Kuok to our stage as our panel. Dr. Kuok is a Lee Kuan Yew Chair at the Brookings Center for Asia Policy Studies, and she's also a senior research fellow at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Kuok was a professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and she is an expert on Southeast Asian and East Asian politics. Dr. Kuok, I'd like to invite you to the stage. And last but not least, it is my great privilege to invite Mr. Pita Limjaroenrat, the former Prime Minister-designate of Thailand. He's also currently a visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Mr. Limjaroenrat is an advocate for transparent and equitable governance on the global scale, and he has a focus on human rights, welfare improvement, and grassroots issues for the current research that he's doing at HKS. Mr. Limjaroenrat, it is a great honor for me to invite you to the stage. Now I'll pass on to Sarah for the panel discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Colin. Lynn, Greg, and Pita, it's such a pleasure to have you here joining us today for our third and final panel of the day. This panel, as Colin mentioned, is going to be looking at security alliances and economic statecraft in the shifting Indo-Pacific. I believe for some of you, it's a return back to Cambridge today. And I wanted to say we apologize for the chilly weather you have today. We were hoping for warmer weather, but I'm sure you can remember the situation in Cambridge weather is almost as unstable as the geopolitical landscape we're about to examine in today's talk. To my mind, today's discussion could not have come probably at a more prescient time for the Indo-Pacific region. I think we're seeing a lot of very interesting emerging and shifting trends in the region, from a rise in minilateralism. We heard earlier today about the rise in economic trade being used as a weapon of diplomacy at times. We have a contested maritime environment as well, heating up. And then, of course, we've got the geopolitical elephant in the room, the great power competition going on in the Indo-Pacific region today between the United States and a rising China. With that in mind, I'd like to throw open this first question to the panel. President Trump has now returned back to the Oval Office, And whilst his first administration was very much focused on a pivot to the Indo-Pacific, we see his second administration being more distracted by ongoing wars in Gaza and also in Ukraine. I'd like to ask the panel, with his administration's focus being pulled away by these competing priorities, what do you think is the biggest implication of the second Trump administration for the region? And which issue do you think he'll be prioritizing in his new Indo-Pacific strategy going forward? Greg? Lynn, would you like to go first?
Then you go ahead.
Well, I suppose when we're looking at the implication of a second Trump administration for Asia, we should first look to where we were prior to his re-entry into office. And in that respect, the signs on the wall were not, or the writing on the wall was not that positive for the United States. In September, I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs saying that the United States is losing Asia. And the reason I said that was both based on a poll conducted by the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, that it's done annually, but also because of conversations that I've had around the region. And I think in that poll, what was quite significant was that 2024 was the very first year in which, when Southeast Asian respondents were asked who they would choose to align with if they had to choose. Now, Southeast Asian respondents don't want to choose, but if they had to choose, who would they choose? And 2024 was the very first year in which respondents selected China over the United States. It was a very small margin in terms of those selecting China over the United States, but if we drilled more deeply into certain countries, we saw a 20 percentage points drop in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, and with countries like Laos, for instance, it was a precipitous 30 percentage drop. So President Trump came into office already slightly on the back foot in this respect. And since he's returned, I think several developments have not been positive for the United States in terms of influence in the region. First, its approach towards the Gaza conflict. We heard President Ramos talk about it earlier. But in terms of the approach towards Gaza, expelling Palestinians in order to build a luxury Riviera is not the best way of approaching things. In terms of its approach towards Europe, forcing Ukraine to agree to a so-called peace deal, which might not be sustainable, at the same time as it offers very little, it puts very little on the table, because it is calling into question whether or not it would be willing to put troops on the ground to secure that peace, and also calling into question whether or not it was interested in the medium to longer run in the security guarantee for Europe as a whole. I mean, it's European allies in NATO. I think that is not very promising if we look at how Asian countries or Southeast Asian countries might feel about the US security umbrella. And finally, I think if we look at its approach towards trade, or its potential approach towards the economy and trade more generally, that might also be potentially negative as well. So tariffs, for instance, as well as the threatened withdrawal from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was already a watered-down version of the TPP or the CPTPP. And I think on your question of which issue the Trump administration might prioritize in its Indo-Pacific strategy, I think we are still seeing its Indo-Pacific strategy unfold. We don't really know how it might look like and whether it looks like the first administration. But I think it's quite clear that the US will be focused on China. We saw Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, as well as various senior officials from the Trump administration talk about how it was refocusing away from Europe to focus on China. But what that focus on China means is not clear yet. So will it be about striking a deal, an economic deal that Mr. Trump considers a victory, or perhaps some other grand bargain? And if so, if that's the goal of the US administration, then we might see it quite pliant in terms of how it approaches Asian countries and China's security concerns there. So for instance, we might see the United States quite willing to throw Taiwan under the bus, and we already see some signs on that. We might question the US commitment to its mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. And so how that evolves will, I suspect, depend on how China is able to respond to the United States and whether or not China can offer up a deal that the United States or President Trump considers a win. If it can't, then I think we will see something along the lines of the first Trump administration, where it was very focused on countering China and working with allies and partners, or important allies and partners, to achieve that countering of China. But even then, I have reservations about that, because the current Trump administration's approach towards what is in its interest appears very narrow. So even working together with allies and partners might not be guaranteed. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, Sarah, first, thank you, and Colin, thank you for inviting me and I guess to be part of today's best panel. Really good to be here. I think you're probably going to hear a lot of agreement across the panel this afternoon. Certainly want to double down on much of what Lynn has just shared. If I can, and you're going to hear it in my accent, I'm an American here taking the Australia's position in the chair. I work for an Australian think tank. I'm the American token in that think tank because I need somebody to translate from one language to another. It doesn't mean I'm on the telephone with Australia most nights of the week, trying to repeat back what we've heard in DC to Canberra and then get some messages from Canberra, not as part of the government, but just as a thinker, back into the echo chambers in Washington, D.C. When I think about this particular question, I think it's a great way to start. Three things that really stand out to me, and much of this I'm going to share is really coming from discussions we've had just even over the last 2 weeks, as we've seen the personnel in the current administration get fleshed out, who's going to be leading, who's going to be the spokesperson. I think we're seeing a real shift inside cabinet. And the thing that I would suggest all of you look for is that the Secretary of Defense, so Hegseth, Secretary of State Rubio, traditionally that's the U.S. face of foreign policy. I think they're actually going to be the point people, but not the drivers of U.S. foreign policy. We're seeing a significant shift, which most of you are probably aware of. That's going to be Commerce and Treasury. So look at those two secretaries as the arm that is going to throw the American foreign policy spear. The tip of the spear might still be state, might still be defense, but look to those involved with economics as being the primary drivers moving forward. Mm-hmm. I totally agree with Lynn that the China focus here is still there. Again, if you look at personnel as policy, it's being filled with China hawks. So the threat or perception of threat in the United States, and particularly in the administration, is that China is and will continue to be a threat moving forward. This question about whether the administration can handle that or be distracted or be pulled in other directions, being able to manage many crises, a poly-crisis that may be occurring, is an open question. What that means for the alliances, we're probably aware on this stage here right now, is also an open question. I think if you look across the greater region, so of course the relationships in Southeast Asia, every state, yes, there is some agreement, but every state in Southeast Asia has their own interests and own reasons, either to be closer to or further from the United States, to hedge a little bit or hedge a lot. If you get a place like Australia, there's also this tension. Like the United States, Australia is a liberal democracy that is fully invested and has been for the last 2 generations in a liberal global world order. Fantasy or not, that's what we've all believed. Myth or not, that's what we've all acted upon. It got Australia security. It got Australia rich. They're going to be invested in that idea for a long time to come, even if the realities are shifting on the ground and the earth is moving underneath their feet. So what does this mean for the alliance structures? I think you're going to see some states are going to try to get on the Trump peace train or economic train, get on now and ride it as far as they can. Others will hesitate and try to jump on later, and some might miss that altogether. What this means for the greater region as the Trump administration renegotiates or reevaluates the security relationships, things like the nuclear umbrella in Europe and elsewhere. Of course, I think we're going to see across East Asia is a number of East Asian states that traditionally have at least dabbled with the idea or thought about getting their own deterrent. Will start to do so even more.
So I think the question asks about the implication of President Trump 2.0. And I think the implication boils down to only 2 things: perception and priorities. Perception from both sides, both Washington and Beijing, on the strength of the rivalry. So if we're here in the United States, the perception of China's strength in the region in Indo-Pacific, that's one. The second one is absolutely, according to the question, the priority that comes down obviously domestically, obviously around the region, obviously China, Japan, India. Those lists are the things that that will tell us the intensification of the implication of Trump 2.0. What's going to continue is the competition has been around for a while. What's going to continue is bilateral over multilateral. Even during Biden administration, it was Indonesia, it was Vietnam, not the entire ASEAN summit. But what's going to change is that this panel shouldn't be called just geopolitics, because it will be geoeconomics as well. It will be about semiconductor, it will be about critical minerals, it will be debt trap diplomacy, it will be about technology standard setting. So those are the things that are changed. The question is, obviously ASEAN is trying to boost the relationship within ASEAN. We're trying to do it with Australia, we're trying to do it with Japan, we're trying to do it with India, we're trying to do it with South Korea. But what's changed again during this time is that foreign policy is an inseparable intersection with domestic politics nowadays. Obviously, everyone wants to diversify away. Everyone wants to be middle power for a very long time, as long as I know. Like today, last year, I was speaking at University of Melbourne, ASEAN-Australia Summit 50th anniversary, and we were talking about, we're on the same side, we're on the same issue, security to the Americans and economics to the Chinese. So how are we going to diversify and things like that? How are we going to operationalize the strategic comprehensive framework between ASEAN and other countries that are not the Sino-American rivalry? I guess that's really the situation of how the implication would be. As of now, I feel like for Thailand, specifically from the Thai perspective, we're just not there yet for us, that we don't have much of a strategic value to offer both sides. But there's some diplomatic spats, some diplomatic sparring between China and America, and that boils down to two recent situations as well. That's a scam operation and the Uyghur deportation in Thailand, from Thailand back to China. So it was the Americans, Marco Rubio started off during his confirmation on January 15th, the importance of human rights, the alliance with Thailand for the past 200 years. The Uyghur was part of, the conflict within Thailand, confined for 11 years. So we're going to make sure that they're not getting sent back to China. Weeks later, after 11 years, they finally got deported back to China within a matter of weeks. So that's kind of, not the prioritized one, but a kind of diplomatic spats, the kind of diplomatic sparring that we started to see. And it's really the government of Thailand that needs to think about geo-strategic balancing when it comes to these things, because you'll become the chess pawn within the major competition between the two. And the scam operation, it's pretty clear, a bank in America went bankrupt because of the scam operation by the scam bosses in Thailand, in Myanmar. So it's unavoidable that we'll become a geopolitical hotspots in the region.
And I completely agree with what you were saying about how geoeconomics is going to likely become increasingly important to the Trump administration. I know that we're still seeing the Trump administration's foreign policy evolve before our eyes. Lynn, I completely agree with you. We're watching it unfold right now in real time. But I wanted to pick up on something that we were talking about earlier in terms of the focus on transactional-based diplomacy and this focus on economic value rather than values-based diplomacy as a framework for foreign policy. Looking at the contrast between the Biden administration's focus on value-based diplomacy in terms of how it approaches partnerships and alliances to this very distinct shift we're seeing under the Trump administration to a more transactional, more pragmatic approach to foreign diplomacy. What do you think are the implications for the region of that shift away from value-based diplomacy? And specifically, if each of you could comment on your relevant countries' perspectives on how that might affect their relationship with the United States. Greg, you're an honorary Australian for today, so.
So I get called on. That's what that means by the other Australian. It's a good question. I mean, I would actually rephrase the question a little bit. So when I think of something like transactional diplomacy and then values-based, For me, the opposite of values-based is interest-based. So interests and values, whichever happens, I tend to think that all diplomacy, or most of it anyway, is transactional at some level, or at least underneath what is being said, there's transactions that are occurring. There's some expectation. And even more so since you probably all learned in your diplomacy courses that it's much the art of getting your interests on somebody else's agenda. And sometimes that means there has to be some reciprocity. You give something to get something. Hopefully you're getting all or most of what you want. You might have to give somebody else something that they want to get there. In that sense, I don't think that transactional focus is actually that useful, but this distinction between putting interests above the moral or values questions versus the other way around, and to suggest that the Biden administration previously was values above interests, didn't mean that the Biden administration wasn't putting interests in there. It just meant that perhaps, and maybe only even in rhetoric, it was listed differently. One was first and one was second. For both administrations, it's still going to be there. As we've already heard, Secretary Rubio has already mentioned it a few times. So it's not going away, but there will be a different emphasis. I also think that for the region, what that might mean is, and we've heard it over again, is that the foreign policy moving forward, and again, it's Secretary Rubio who articulated it probably better than the president, is whatever that policy is going to be, whatever that diplomacy is going to look like, it needs to make Americans stronger, safer, and more prosperous. So I don't know how those are going to be measured, but everything is going to be evaluated against those three criteria. What is good for Americans first? Doesn't mean it can't be good for others, but that's how it's going to start. I mean, security partnerships will certainly change. Right? The administration is looking for others to step up, others to share a greater burden, and to show specifically how they're going to do so. The president, I know, changes his mind, and I know he likes to say, I know that you did that for me last year, but I guarantee he's going to say, but what are you doing for me right now, or what are you doing this year? Everybody in the region is going to hear that, even the closest partners. The economic relationships also have shifted. Again, with that focus on commerce and treasury, much is going to be looked at in the White House, in DC, as this bilateral trade relationships. I have to say, for Australia, Australia has a terrific story to tell. Unlike some very, very close allies, Australia has this trade ratio or dependency value with the United States, which is actually in America's favor. Australia offers up its geography to the U.S. Marines, to the U.S. Navy, to U.S. Space Force, right? Already putting forward not just money, but also time, also a place. The geography is perfect for U.S. strategy. What Australia really needs and always looked for with its fear of abandonment is that the Americans would have a strategy in the greater region which wouldn't include them, which wouldn't include the Australians at all. It could cut Australia out. The fear of abandonment is part of Australia's foreign policy psyche, right, for generations. By having an agreement like AUKUS, it keeps the United States perpetually in Australia, always concerned about the relationship with Australia. If AUKUS is thought of as the integration of a defense industrial base, they rely upon each other. You can't have one with the other. The Americans are locked in from the Australian perspective. The reverse is also true. From the American perspective, the Australians are locked in, right? So we've entrapped each other, perhaps, moving forward. And then, of course, I think for the greater region, there's this concern about aid dependency, what aid will mean and what it will look like. And that is where I think we will see a lot of change across the region. In some places, I expect after 60 to 75 days, whatever we're waiting for now, many programs will come back in a different form or with a different tone. Others, I think, will be dropped completely. And that will be very disruptive either way, because, again, I think the focus is going to be on how does this specifically meet U.S. interests, and then other interests will have to come second, third, or further down the line.
Well, I too prefer the framing of interests versus values. So thank you, Greg, for highlighting that. I think the Trump administration puts interests first in two ways. One is its America First approach, but in a sense that's not that different from any other administration nor any other country. I cannot think of a single country that would say another country comes before itself. I think it's just Trump putting it more bluntly. So in that respect, I see no change. Seeking to put interests before values as well, I mean, the Biden administration might have focused a little bit more on talking about authoritarian states versus democracies, but ultimately it was interest-driven. Again, I see no problem in that. What is problematic, or the difference that I see, is that the Trump administration has a rather narrow vision or understanding of what is in the US interests. So for instance, it doesn't think or doesn't hold allies in very much regard, nor ensuring that it is seen as credible by its allies, whereas previous administrations, I think, uniformly have considered allies as important and maintaining US credibility amongst allies as important. It doesn't think much about the rule of law and its contributions to a stable world order. And finally, the Trump administration doesn't think very much, it doesn't appear to think very much of multilateralism and multilateral institutions. And so the point of departure is less that interests matter, but the vision of what constitutes US interests being very narrow. And in terms of how that might affect its engagement with countries in Asia, I think at least in Southeast Asia, countries are very pragmatic. They know they are dealing with the US as interested in pursuing its interests. So they're quite comfortable with that. But I think what is less comforting or works against the United States is that the United States right now almost has an accountant-like sense of balancing the sheets, right? And it's about looking at dollars and cents and seeing where a country stands in the ledger as a trade surplus, as a trade deficit, and what does the US need to do in response to that. And it seems less good or less willing to look at other non-tangible benefits, like basing benefits or the use of facilities in the region for the US military. And so I think my sense as I see this administration unfold, that it's what Oscar Wilde says, it's an administration that knows the cost of everything but the value of nothing. So I think that's kind of how I would express how this what you call transactionalism or what we call interest-based approach might hurt its engagement with the region.
Yeah, so I agree with both. It's not about interest versus values. That's been around for quite a long time in many countries, but it's the lack of institutional reliability, it's a lack of consistency, it's a lack of predictability that makes each of the countries that's trying to maintain the strategic autonomy while balancing the superpower without knowing what to expect. So those are the things that the government of each country needs to prepare for. The question also asked about each country specifically. So for Thailand, I feel like we have to diversify not just on the foreign affairs front, but really build up domestic capability within the country as well, both defense, both domestic economy, rather than relying on the international trade and investment all the time. That's something that a country like Thailand is something that's specific to a country like Thailand.
Go ahead, just one thing, and I'd be very curious, and maybe some of you can approach us after the event today or during the happy hour to correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that across the greater region, some countries would look at this change about interests versus values as a very positive thing. The United States is famous in this part of the world, but also other parts of the world for preaching, for giving speeches about the American way and American rights and human rights and what you have to do to be on the good side. And so even a change in tone or rhetoric, not that the Americans still don't care about those things, but pulling back a little bit will actually maybe allow some countries in the region to think that they can do more with a U.S. partnership without having some of those ties. Again, I don't think that applies across the whole region. It certainly doesn't apply in the Australian context, or I'd say the New Zealanders, or many of the Pacific Islanders necessarily, but I think in the greater region there'll be a variety of responses to this shift.
And shifting topics slightly onto responses from the region, specifically on maritime insecurity, I'd like to throw this next question to you, Lynn. So newly appointed Secretary of State Marco Rubio was recently in the news criticizing China for dangerous and destabilizing actions in the South China Sea. I'm sure those of us who are from the region are very familiar with the ongoing contested maritime conflicts that are occurring in the South China Sea, as well as other contested maritime areas in the region. Lynn, I'd like to know, how do you anticipate the Trump administration will position themselves on the South China Sea specifically? And how should Southeast Asian countries prepare for this change under the Trump administration in terms of their collective security?
Thanks for that, Sarah. So I think all of you know that the South China Sea has been a flashpoint in the region. It's important because it's a major trade artery or trade route. And it's also very important because we could see war break out over the South China Sea in several ways, but I think there are two main ways. One, we could see an escalation of an incident at sea or in the air, because we have various navies exercising their freedoms of the seas in the South China Sea and China objecting, and there have sometimes been close encounters or dangerous maneuvers. In the past, it's led to collisions in the air. So in 2001, there was the EP3 incident when a US spy plane collided with a Chinese fighter jet, and that fortunately was the tensions, they managed to dial it down, but now the context between the United States, or the relations between the United States and China, is far worse, and we also have social media to add oil into any fire. So it's really concerning that you might have an incident at sea or air escalate into a broader conflict. And then the other way we might have escalation in the South China Sea, the other main way, is where we have the Philippines, and I'm sure some of you might have read this in the news, where you have the Philippines and China. There's minor skirmishes around low tide elevations and submerged features in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. They're relatively minor. I mean, the worst case that's happened, and it's sad, but it's not like calamitous, is like a Philippine sailor lost his thumb. However, the United States and the Philippines share a mutual defense treaty, and in the event of an armed attack, what's interpreted as an armed attack, you might well see the United States drawn into a conflict with China over these relatively minor skirmishes. So the South China Sea is important because trade, because of the potential for escalation, but also because even short of conflict, we're concerned about what happens there because of its implications for the rule of law in the region as well as elsewhere. Because where we have the rule of law undermined seriously in one part of the world, it's undermined everywhere. So in terms of how the Trump administration might approach the South China Sea dispute and its implications, I think what we do know thus far is how it approached it during the first administration. So we often forget that it was under the first Trump administration and not the Obama administration before that that we saw the United States actually embrace the South China Sea Tribunal ruling in the Philippines case against China, the merits of the ruling. Prior to that, under the Obama administration, all the Obama administration said was, you, China, and the Philippines, you have to follow the ruling. Under the Trump administration, for all that's been criticized, all that President Trump has been criticized about not caring about the rule of law, his administration, under Secretary Pompeo, actually said, we, America, accept the merits of the ruling. And it was under the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, that the United States clarified the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty to cover the South China Sea as well, and Philippines Coast Guard. So they actually clarified the Mutual Defense Treaty and strengthened its commitment to the Philippines in that respect. So we know that, and that was reassuring. And under this administration, we have already seen Secretary Rubio also clarified the Mutual Defense Treaty, saying that it does cover the South China Sea and it does cover Philippine Coast Guard, promising as well. We also have bipartisan support within Congress for the Philippines and the Mutual Defense Treaty. However, we have also seen President Trump very allergic to military entanglements and treating allies in Europe perhaps a little bit roughly. So I wonder, despite these commitments declared by Secretary Rubio, whether or not we might see the United States actually, in practice, perhaps walk back a little bit in terms of its commitments to the Philippines under the Mutual Defense Treaty. If I were the Philippines, I would probably be thinking twice about pushing forward as hard as it has been in terms of trying to secure its economic rights vis-a-vis China. I hope it doesn't, but one might think that it will. And I think this might actually reassure some Southeast Asian countries who have been worried about the implications of the Philippines' pushback against China for stability in the region. So Southeast Asian countries are not very comfortable with this pushback, and they're worried about escalation in the region. But I worry about that because, the Philippines has the law on its side in terms of its economic rights to the waters in its exclusive economic zone. And I think, having a sort of short-term stability, that will be a stability that is very short-lived, because any stability that's arrived at without adherence to the rule of law, I think, will be a very fragile one. So the only foundation upon which we can build stability or long-term stability is the rule of law. So I worry about what might happen in the South China Sea. We might see short-term greater stability, but in the longer term, I think the breakdown of the rule of law and the longer-term conflict.
Thanks for that, Lynn. And I completely agree with you in that the South China Sea, I think, is a very concerning potential flashpoint in the power conflicts that are going on in the region. I think most of what we hear about, at least at the Kennedy School, is often very focused on Taiwan and the Malacca Strait. But I completely agree. I think South China Sea is actually very much underestimated as a potential flashpoint for the region that might draw into a bigger conflict. Greg, building off that question about how the region itself might actually see shifting power balance, I know you've recently published an article for ASPI that was outlining 4 different potential scenarios for the Indo-Pacific going forward. And in that article, you mentioned 2 particular factors that will determine which of those scenarios do play out. The first one, which we've actually already touched on in today's talk, was around the level of US attention that they're able to give to the region. But the second one was about the US's perception of China's strength going forward. Are you able to give us a brief overview of that report, the 4 scenarios, and which way you think it might actually pan out?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Happy to do so. So my team at ASPI USA in DC held this workshop, an alternative futures workshop. We did it before the US election. So we tried to remove the personalities from the discussion. We invited several external experts to come in. We sat them down. We ran them through an alternative exercise, a structured analytic exercise, one that, of course, is going to be determined by the people in the room that day, what they had for lunch, what the weather was like, all the things that matter, right? But also something that could be replicated. So that's why we chose this particular approach to building different scenarios. Because we did it before the election, we tried to, again, remove personalities, not make it about a future Harris administration or a future Trump administration. We wanted to look at, more generally, at a number of structural factors which might determine whether the United States might be in place A, B, C, or D 4 years from now, almost regardless of who is in office during that period of time. What we did is we walked those experts through a series of steps, the first being, please help us understand what you think all of the factors are that might determine where the U.S. ends up with regard to its position in the Indo-Pacific 4 years from now. The group that we got together over the course of just about an hour and a half produced more than 120 different factors. So, economic factors, political factors, military factors, technological factors, social media factors, kept going on and on and on, right? They argued about it. We got everything up on the board. Everybody had a chance to look at them, and then we put them through a winnowing exercise. So through another series of steps, we got it down from more than 120 different factors to 2. And the criteria by which we asked them to choose the 2 most important factors is 1, uncertainty. Which of these 2 factors are very uncertain, whether it will go one way or the other? And 2, the significance or how determinative that factor is for where the U.S. will be in the Pacific 4 years from now. So almost like the impact or the weight of it, right? And then the uncertainty level. So the 2 factors I selected as most impactful, or most determinative, and also most uncertain were, what is the U.S. perception of threat going to be with regard to China 4 years from now, or over the course of the next 4 years? And 2, what is the level of U.S. focus on the Indo-Pacific? Another way of saying, what's the level of U.S. distraction, keeping it from the Indo-Pacific? We set it up thinking, oh, we go back to 2012, U.S. pivot, nice, let's do it. Didn't happen. Let's do a little bit here and there, right, across the Obama administration, both of them, and then Trump administration, yes, but not really a pivot. Let's do more in the region, yes, but we're never quite there. Everybody in the room recognized that right away. In an interesting way, those of us who organized it, we thought these would be the 2 most important factors before we started, but we kept our mouths shut. The experts brought in actually came to the same conclusion. These were going to be the most important things. What we did then is we just stuck these on a 2x2, right? It just becomes a matrix. So you end up with 4 different categories with those 2 factors. Level of distraction and the threat perception that China might pose to the United States. So 1 is very much about how the U.S. thinks about it, and 2 is that what can the U.S. do about it, right? Capabilities and also its an intent to do something. We then had them give us a skeleton understanding of what that might look like 4 years from now. And then when they left, we wrote up some notional scenarios for what it would look like based upon what that expert group gave us. So we came up, you have to refer to the actual names of the taglines we gave. The first scenario, of course, then is follow US or follow us. This is where the US perception of the Chinese threat is extremely high, but the US actually has a very high focus on the Indo-Pacific. In our scenario, what that meant is that all the other distractions around the world, Ukraine, Red Sea, Middle East, US handles that. Finds a way to extract itself from being distracted. I know that's going to be the hardest thing ever. It's a tough landscape, but does so in a way that its pivot to Asia actually happens and the threat perception is extremely high. Then tries to pull the allies and partners all along with it. So follow us, follow US. US is leading the way, and it's there in a big way 4 years from now. The other categories or the other names of the scenarios were the peaceful pivot. This is also one where the US focus is very high in the Indo-Pacific, and the threat perception from China is lower. So idea of the peaceful pivot is it's not necessarily competition with China, but the US still is making the region the center of gravity for its economy, right? For security moving forward, at least for the next generation. We try to determine whether this would have meant that there's some sort of compact or some sort of agreement with China that you could end up in this situation, or in fact that there's a realization in the United States that because of its economy and other limitations it might have, China just is not able to project power as it once did, and that the region recognizes that as well. The other 2 scenarios were leading from behind. Low China power, at least the perception of that in the United States, and a low level of US perception. This is where the allies and partners in the region get a chance to step up on their own. The US doesn't think China is a big deal, but also the US is really not in the region as well. We didn't envision a full retrenchment, right? It's not that the US pulls out of the region altogether, it's just that it's not really focused. It's not going to be the primary region, the pivot doesn't happen. And the last one is the failing to walk and chew gum, right? The idea that the China threat is significant, it's real. Everybody in Washington, D.C. is talking about it, but the level of US attention is low. Distractions are enormous. The poly crisis keeps the Americans hopping from one thing to another, never really truly making that focus on the Pacific and making the pivot reality doesn't happen. In this scenario, of course, it's almost the worst of possible worlds, because then China, from a US perception, is able to do what it wants, but the United States feels it's unable to do much at all and is not able to lead the rest of the allies. That's it.
Thanks for that, Greg. That's really interesting. And as a former management consultant, I very much appreciate you mapped out the entire future of the region on a 2x2. That's why.
I should say that the exercise of 2 is not about forecasting. Like, we didn't try to select which one was most likely. The purpose wasn't. The purpose was to say what's the range of possibilities. And these are only 4 possibilities. We could go double. We could go 16 more scenarios if we wanted to. So when we ask, well, what's the most important one, or which one's most likely? I don't know. If you ask my opinion, I'm going to say the U.S. focus on China as a threat is going to remain high. I am very uncertain whether the U.S. will be able to make the full pivot.
Priorities.
In the interest of time, I'll cut off in there in terms of the number of scenarios we do look at today. Peter, I'm going to throw to you for our final question of the panel, but Peter has a very hard cutoff in terms of catching a flight. So if people do have questions they want to ask the panel, if everyone could please start lining up behind the microphones that are there, and I think we have a couple also on the upper levels as well. That would help us get through them quickly.
Thank you for putting me on the spot, Matt. I apologize.
So Peter, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on ASEAN. I think you can't talk about the Asia-Pacific without talking about ASEAN.
Right.
And you yourself as a big proponent of ASEAN, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how Thailand and other ASEAN nations will see ASEAN itself navigating the complex landscape we're seeing between the US and China, particularly with this shift we're seeing in the region away from multilateralism towards the new minilateral alliances of the 21st century that we're seeing a real pivot away from. How do you see ASEAN navigating that new great power conflict and the shift towards multilateralism?
Well, in order to accomplish something, the centrality and relevancy has to come back first. I mean, ASEAN has been there for a very long time, and there's some historical achievement that they can do, but they don't realize the future potential together. So that's why to really navigate something as a bloc, it becomes quite a hard situation to do. And I proposed when I was the Prime Minister-designated, when I was still in the coalition, that finally we have to think about the role of SecGen of ASEAN, for example, something that we have to expand, and we have to think about the difference between non-interference and non-indifference. Those are the things that has been around for a very, very long time. But that's why, for example, the case of Myanmar, 5-point consensus become 5 bullet points and not a 5-year roadmap. So there's no continuation. As for Thailand, we have to start thinking about foreign policy as an a la carte and not a buffet. In the past 10 years, because we had a military coup in Thailand back 10 years ago, and Obama administration, cut down the diplomatic ties, the European people finally cut it out. And also, the perfect storm came from Trump 1.0, so America first. So we felt completely the absence of the Americans 10 years ago until today. So finally, foreign policy becomes a buffet towards the Chinese. So we probably have to balance it back a little bit. But it doesn't mean that we have to choose sides, whether, if we want to go for a meal, we have to go buffet with the Chinese or buffet with the Americans, but we have to think about it as an a la carte and finally find time to branch out to other allies in the region and among ourselves as well. A quick stat to cut off what I'm answering is, it used to be 25%. The Thai total trade portfolio between ASEAN this year is 20. And the total trade Thailand and American and Chinese combined is 58. So, if it's a total trade portfolio, we are overweighted with the Sino-American rivalry parties, but very underweighted within ASEAN themselves. So, infrastructure gap, harmonizing payment system and trade system and all those will have to come in effect very soon in order to balance it out a little bit.
I think that's a perfect metaphor to leave you all with, which is that we're seeing a shift in the Indo-Pacific away from an a la carte menu towards a buffet menu for the region.
From buffet to a la carte, yes.
We might pause there and just start on the Q&As. Esther, do you want to ask the first question? I'll just ask everyone who's asking a question, please briefly state your name before you start with the question as well.
Hi, I'm Esther. I know I'm part of the organizing team, but I still want to ask a question. And my question is primarily for Pita and for Lynn. We talk a lot about US and Southeast Asia relations, or US and Asia Pacific, but I want to ask about the region's relations with China. I think, Pita, you mentioned as well, we compartmentalize our relationship. Like, we're very good on economy, but when it comes to security, South China Sea, we don't really want to think about it, or like we only see China through these two lenses. And up until a certain point, I think Southeast Asian countries need to start consider China as a real and potential threat for our security. But what I'm seeing is that these countries, our country, my country, Indonesia, is just like very chill in terms of this. Like, they're not really thinking far ahead in terms of what if there's an actual escalation in the region, in the Indo-Pacific with China, what do we do then? So can you please comment about how we should start thinking about the real risk and real threat of China in the future, and what can we do from now to start anticipating those?
So to put that question into perspective for the audience so that you can understand, the trade surplus between Thailand and America used to be 20 billion US during Trump 1.0, now is 35 US billion. And trade deficit with China between Thailand and China is 45 billion US. So it's obviously a buffet towards a particular polar. And because we were too short-sighted about things, that we over-reliance and we didn't have that counterweight diplomacy in order to make sure that our attempt is not too little too late. But as of now, I would argue that it's too little too late, because we are always relying on a particular polar. And when it comes to things that we have to speak up, such as like maritime navigation, just like you said, it's a slippery slope It has nothing to do with Thailand. It's usually with the Philippines or Vietnam. But it becomes a slippery slope that when you allow, might makes right and right doesn't make might, you don't return to UNCLOS, you don't return to maritime navigation. That's when Mekong region or something that involves Thailand will become something that, because you didn't speak up then, 5 years later, that's why you're in trouble and you don't have that kind of muscle to self-determination of your own country.
Thank you for your question, Esther, and thank you for this great conference. And let me also take this opportunity to thank the other organizers, Esther, Sindu, and all of you, Colin. Thank you very much, and Sarah, of course, for sharing the session. I think your question is a very valid one, in the sense that Southeast Asia tends to try to keep its head in the sand or bury its head in the sand in terms of China. But I would prefer to frame China not as a threat per se, but Chinese activities, some of them are threatening, right? And some of them are problematic. And in that respect, I think we need to see more from Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN as a whole condemning some of these problematic activities so that there is pushback against it. So for instance, despite ongoing issues in the South China Sea, we still have seen no strong ASEAN statement calling out China for its activities in the South China Sea, and we need to see that happen. You come from Indonesia, I believe, right? And Indonesia recently signed a joint statement with China, and it's of course good to have good relations with your neighbors, but in that joint statement, Indonesia talked about joint cooperation in the South China Sea. And of course, the question would be over what waters, because Indonesia has rights to exclusive economic zone, and a tribunal has found that China has no valid claim to the waters within the 9-dash line insofar as it was beyond China's own exclusive economic zone. And the other thing in that joint statement that was quite problematic but perhaps underreported was the fact that Indonesia in that statement had language that very strongly adhered to China's language on Taiwan. And so that was problematic as well. So I'd like to see more from Southeast Asia in terms of calling out problematic Chinese or unlawful Chinese activities. But I think the difficulty, of course, is that many are afraid of sticking their neck out. There's so much at stake in terms of economic relations, which Pita pointed out with China. But perhaps some of it can be framed more about supporting the rule of law as opposed to being against China. And that might not completely satisfy China, but at least that's one step. And then I think we need to also talk about how we can sort of move away from the buffet to one that at least increases the strategic autonomy of ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries. So to my mind, I think 3 ways, none of which are perfect, but I think it helps to boost strategic autonomy. Number 1 would be, of course, ASEAN centrality and the importance of ASEAN. ASEAN needs to start acting like a bloc as opposed to individual countries, some of which are very close to China, some of which are closer to the United States. They need to think about ASEAN's interests first and foremost. And the fact that they haven't been able to resolve or even manage issues like the Myanmar conflict and the South China Sea issue, that doesn't bode well. So ASEAN really must do better. Second, I think, focus on the rule of law and the promotion of the rule of law. I think every country in Southeast Asia has generally talked about the importance of the rule of law, but they need to put their money where the mouth is. So they cannot be worried about the Philippines pushing back against its own economic rights, pushing back against China to secure its own economic rights in the South China Sea, because a tribunal has found that clearly is Philippines' economic rights. So they need to be more supportive in terms of adhering and promoting the rule of law, not just talking about it. And third, I think this has been mentioned, but engagement with partners apart from the United States and China. And in this respect, polls have showed that the favored partners are European countries, as well as Japan. But of course, the danger there is that Europe is so consumed right now with the conflict in its own continent, and I think there's going to be problems in terms of the European engagement with the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia in particular. So, but Southeast Asia still needs to try to engage more with European partners, Japan, India, South Korea, etc., to bolster that strategic autonomy within the region. Thank you.
So unfortunately, in the interest of time, we might have to cut it there in terms of Q&A, but I'd encourage all of you who did not get to ask a question to come up and ask the question of the speakers afterwards. We'll just wrap there in terms of timing, and I'll call Colin up to the stage to conclude the final panel. But thank you everyone for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Quick photo. Can we do a quick